Welcome to the History Max podcast.
It is great to be here.
So, standard historical narratives usually they train us to view colonization as this very abrupt, almost mechanical process.
It's absolutely like a simple flip of a switch.
Yeah, exactly. The textbooks present this neat formula where a European fleet arrives on a coastline, they unload some soldiers with superior gunpowder, fight a single decisive battle, and boom, they raise a flag.
Yeah, and then the timeline just splits cleanly into a before and an after.
Yeah. And the subjugation of the local population is just recorded as this accomplished fact.
Which, that formula relies heavily on the assumption that having a technological advantage just automatically guarantees a swift political victory.
Right.
It's a narrative of inevitability, really. Historians have relied on it for generations to kind of explain the rapid expansion of these global empires.
But when you examine the sources detailing the southern Philippines, specifically the archipelagos of Mindanao and Sulu, that neat chronological formula just completely shatters.
It really does. It falls apart completely.
We are looking at a conflict that totally defies the traditional colonial blueprint. The sources we have gathered for this deep dive document the Spanish-Moro conflict.
Which is just an agonizingly long struggle.
Yeah, a 333-year struggle stretching from 1565 to 1898. Waged between the Spanish Empire and the Moro sultanates of the south, so primarily Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanao.
And just to contextualize that duration for you, 333 years represents the longest continuous anti-colonial resistance in the history of Southeast Asia.
That is just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. It's a span of time that outlasts the entire lifespan of a lot of modern nations.
So our mission today is to thoroughly dissect this stalemate. We're going to examine how the friction of religion, transnational commerce, shifting global empires, and, these radical leaps in naval technology all collided in these islands.
Because the Spanish crown poured unimaginable fortunes into this theater.
Right.
They sacrificed thousands of soldiers. And they irrevocably altered the geopolitical architecture of the region, but they never actually achieved absolute subjugation.
So let's start at the beginning, because the foundational error the Spanish made, the one that established the parameters for the next 3 centuries that happened in the late 1500s, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Following their initial arrival, the Spanish forces successfully conquered the northern settlement of Manila.
And they displaced its Islamic ruler, Raja Suleiman.
Right. And when reviewing the dispatches and royal decrees from this early period, the ideological posture of the Spanish administrators really stands out.
They didn't view the displacement of Raja Suleiman as just like a mere territorial acquisition, did they?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The Spanish forces arriving in the Pacific were thoroughly indoctrinated with a geopolitical worldview of the Reconquista.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that's the critical lens for understanding the initial violence, I think.
It is. So the Reconquista was the centuries-long military campaign by Christian kingdoms to expel the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate and its successor states from the Iberian Peninsula.
Right, back in Europe.
Right. So the Spanish arrived in the Philippine archipelago, carrying this deeply institutionalized generational directive to halt the expansion of Islam and universally impose Catholicism.
It was an ideology forged in Europe, but aggressively exported to the Pacific.
Exactly.
So they sail halfway across the globe, they anchor in the Philippines, and immediately encounter their familiar ideological adversaries.
Yeah, but here's where Spanish intelligence completely misread the landscape. They assumed the Muslim populations in the south were just these isolated, fractured chiefdoms.
Which they weren't.
No, the Moro sultanates were entirely the opposite. They operated as crucial nodes within this vast, highly lucrative and interconnected Islamic maritime network.
Right, this wasn't just some local kingdom.
No. This network facilitated the movement of goods, scholars, armaments, all flowing from the coastal cities of China, through the Indonesian archipelago, and all the way across the Indian Ocean to the Middle East.
So the Spanish weren't initiating a localized border dispute. They were directly attacking the periphery of a global economic system.
Precisely. And the documentation of the initial Spanish offensive reveals a policy rooted in economic extraction.
Yeah, acting under existing Iberian legal frameworks that actually permitted the enslavement of populations actively opposing the Catholic faith.
Right. Spanish expeditionary forces began systematically raiding southern settlements. They captured local inhabitants, subjected them to forced conversions, and integrated them into the trans-Pacific labor economy.
Even shipping them across the ocean to Spanish territories in the Americas sometimes.
Yes. And the economic logic behind this was entirely self-sustaining. I mean, the Spanish crown could not perpetually fund the Philippine garrison from the treasury all the way in Madrid.
It was just too expensive.
Way too expensive. So by turning captured adversaries into commodified labor, the Spanish military commanders generated the revenue they needed to purchase provisions, construct fortifications, and, physically pay their soldiers.
But introducing a profit motive that is directly tied to human captivity virtually guarantees perpetual warfare.
It really does.
You just cannot establish an economy reliant on enslaving your neighbors and expect a diplomatic resolution to ever happen.
Exactly. So the Moro leaders responded by declaring a jihad to defend their territorial integrity and their religious institutions.
They mobilized their naval assets, right?
Yes, and they launched severe retaliatory raids against Spanish-controlled settlements in the northern and central islands, particularly targeting the Visayas region.
And the scale of these early Moro offensives really demonstrates their formidable logistical capabilities. I mean, the source is detail-specific, highly coordinated campaigns.
Yeah, let's look at 1599. Raja Salongan, the ruler of the Buayan Sultanate, allied with Datu Salicula of Maguindanao.
They assembled an expeditionary force of 3,000 warriors.
Right. They crossed the open ocean and assaulted the coastal infrastructure of Cebu, Negros, and Panay.
Just systematically dismantling the agricultural base.
Yeah, they razed the settlements and captured hundreds of subjects for their own labor force.
And then they followed this up with another huge fleet in 1600, attempting to permanently break the Spanish agricultural supply lines.
They did.
Reading through these sources, I found myself struggling to reconcile the military strategies here. It's like two completely different operating systems clashing.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, because the Spanish approach operated on this rigid land-based doctrine. They measured success by drawing territorial boundaries, cutting down jungles to build stone fortresses, and attempting to physically garrison land masses.
Yes.
But the Moro strategic doctrine was entirely maritime and highly fluid.
Completely fluid.
They viewed the ocean not as a geographic barrier, but as a primary infrastructure network.
Right. They measured power by controlling trade routes and human capital,
Yeah.
not by occupying empty terrain.
Exactly. So it raises the question of whether the Spanish military apparatus even possessed the operational flexibility to fight a decentralized ocean-going adversary.
The historical record suggests they completely lacked that flexibility for decades.
Yeah.
Traditional Spanish military doctrine relied on drawing the enemy into pitched, decisive engagements where European infantry formations and heavy artillery could just dictate the outcome.
But the Moro fleets refused to accommodate that doctrine.
Right. They utilized the archipelagic geography to their advantage. They would strike coastal targets rapidly, disperse their shallow draft vessels into complex river systems.
And just evaporate before a Spanish galleon could even maneuver into a firing position.
Exactly. And the Spanish administrative correspondence from Manila eventually reflects this realization. They recognized that their capital in the north was simply too distant to project any meaningful naval deterrence over the southern seas.
They needed a foothold closer to the action.
Right. They realized they needed a permanent, fortified staging ground deep within Moro territory to disrupt the maritime raiding networks at their source.
And that strategic pivot materialized in 1635.
Yes. The Spanish command dispatched an engineering and military expedition to the southwestern tip of the Mindanao Peninsula.
And there, they constructed Fort San Jose, which became the nucleus of the fortified city of Zamboanga.
And the establishment of Fort Zamboanga represented an enormous commitment of resources. It was designed to choke off the passage of Moro fleets heading north.
Right. From this heavily armed position, Spanish commanders began launching direct, sustained assaults against powerful regional leaders.
Including the highly influential Sultan Kudarat of Maguindanao.
And for a brief period, the Spanish military strategy actually appeared to be gaining traction.
It did, yeah.
But then the entire geopolitical calculus was violently disrupted in 1662 by an external variable that no Spanish governor could have ever anticipated.
No, they never saw it coming. The disruption originated over 1,000 miles to the north, driven by the collapse of the Ming dynasty in China.
Right.
A Chinese military commander and Ming loyalist, known as Koxinga, refused to submit to the newly established Qing dynasty.
So Needing a secure base of operations, Koxinga led an enormous fleet to the island of Formosa, which is known today as Taiwan.
Yes. And in a highly sophisticated amphibious campaign, he defeated the entrenched Dutch East India Company garrison and completely expelled them from the island.
And having successfully defeated one European maritime power, Koxinga immediately turned his attention southward toward the Spanish Philippines.
Right. And the diplomatic exchange that followed it's one of the most surreal events documented in these sources.
It really is. Koxinga decided to demand formal tribute from the Spanish governor in Manila, coupled with the threat of a full-scale invasion if they refused.
Yes, but the delivery mechanism for this threat was highly unorthodox. Koxinga did not send a traditional military envoy. He dispatched an Italian Dominican friar named Riccio, who had been operating as a missionary in China.
Which is wild. Friar Riccio arrives in the port of Manila dressed in the official silk robes of a Chinese Mandarin nobleman.
Right. And he presents the Spanish Catholic governor with an ultimatum demanding subservience to a non-Christian foreign warlord.
The psychological impact on the Spanish administration must have been catastrophic.
Oh, completely. Because they were receiving intelligence that Koxinga commanded tens of thousands of battle-hardened troops.
And a vast armada that had just incorporated captured Dutch naval assets.
Right. So the Spanish High Command in Manila was seized by total strategic paralysis.
They calculated that their current troop deployments were severely inadequate to repel a unified invasion of that magnitude.
So their immediate concern shifted from projecting power in the south to fortifying the capital at all costs.
And this paranoia manifested internally with just horrific consequences.
It did. Manila contained a large population of Chinese merchants, artisans, and laborers who were absolutely vital to the colony's economy. But the Spanish authorities, operating under the assumption that these residents would act as a fifth column and sabotage the city's defenses from the inside.
They issued edicts demanding their relocation.
Yes. And the Chinese community interpreted these edicts as the preliminary steps to a purge, which led to isolated uprisings.
And the Spanish response was absolute and disproportionate. Driven by the fear of this impending siege, the colonial military and local militias initiated a preemptive massacre.
The documentation indicates that 22,000 Chinese residents of Manila were executed.
22,000?
Yes. It was an act of mass violence fueled entirely by the anticipated arrival of Koxinga's fleet.
Right. And simultaneously, the Spanish governor issued an immediate recall order for every available soldier in the southern theater.
They systematically dismantled their coastal outposts.
In early 1663, the Spanish garrison completely evacuated Fort Zamboanga, abandoning their primary strategic anchor in the region.
Right. And the most profound historical irony of this entire sequence of events is that the invasion never even materialized.
Because Koxinga contracted a severe tropical fever shortly after issuing his ultimatum.
Yes, and he died on Formosa before his armada could launch.
I really want to examine the structural implications of that moment for you. A Chinese warlord, who never actually deployed a single soldier to the Philippine archipelago, managed to completely dismantle the Spanish southern military infrastructure without firing a shot.
It's incredible. If we look at the timeline, the Spanish military essentially vanished from Mindanao.
And the sudden absence of the Spanish Navy created a vast power vacuum that the Moro sultanates immediately utilized.
Right. The period following 1663 initiated an era of unimpeded autonomy for the southern fleets.
By removing that fortified choke point at Zamboanga, the Spanish inadvertently granted the Moros a half-century reprieve from colonial pressure.
Yes, 50 years of unchecked maritime operations.
But wait, if the Spanish possessed the resources of a global empire and the invasion threat dissolved with Koxinga's death almost immediately, why did it take them so long to correct the error?
That's a good question.
I mean, why wait 55 years to reclaim their strategic position?
Well, rebuilding a heavily fortified military installation requires immense capital, specialized engineering corps, and highly secure supply lines.
Right.
Following the Koxinga panic and those subsequent internal disruptions, Manila's standing as a secure commercial hub was deeply damaged.
The economy was in ruins.
Exactly. The royal treasury simply lacked the liquidity to fund a massive expeditionary force to reclaim a jungle peninsula hundreds of miles away.
So it required decades of economic recovery before the colonial administration could even contemplate projecting power southward again.
Yes. So the timeline shifts to 1718.
The Spanish administration finally allocates the resources to return. They sail south and rebuild the fortifications at Zamboanga.
But they're not walking into a pacified region.
No.
They are walking into a deeply entrenched, heavily armed maritime network that has operated without colonial interference for 2 generations.
And the Moro response to the Spanish return was immediate and forcible.
Very forceful. In 1720, just 2 years after the fort was reestablished, an alliance led by the Datu of Butig mobilized a fleet carrying over 5,000 warriors.
They enveloped Fort Zamboanga, initiating a siege that lasted for 2 continuous months.
And the Spanish garrison barely maintained their perimeter, relying entirely on the superiority of their static artillery.
So the sources from the 1700s describe this environment of relentless attrition. The Moro fleets optimized their raiding operations, capturing thousands of prisoners annually from the northern islands.
The regional slave trade expanded significantly, and standard commercial shipping lanes were virtually paralyzed.
Yet, alongside this sophisticated military conflict, the Spanish administration repeatedly demonstrated a profound lack of diplomatic competence.
Oh, absolutely. The handling of Sultan Alaeddin of Jolo provides a very clear example of this administrative failure.
Let's talk about that. Sultan Ali Muddin's interactions with the Spanish authorities really illustrate the deep structural flaws in their colonial diplomacy.
They do. So in 1749, Ali Muddin was deposed from the Jolo Sultanate due to internal political friction with his brother.
Right. He traveled to Manila seeking an alliance and formally expressed a desire to convert to Catholicism.
Now, from a strategic standpoint, this presented the Spanish with an unprecedented opportunity.
Yeah, cultivating a baptized allied sultan with a legitimate claim to the throne of Jolo could have fractured the Moro resistance from within.
Exactly. And the initial Spanish response actually seemed favorable. They baptized him in 1750 with full ceremonial honors.
But the political goodwill evaporated almost immediately, didn't it?
It did. The ecclesiastical leadership, specifically the Archbishop of Manila, maintained a deep skepticism regarding the authenticity of Ali Muddin's conversion.
All right.
Shortly after the baptism, Spanish intelligence intercepted a letter that they interpreted as evidence of his continued communication with anti-Spanish factions.
And based on this single piece of, frankly, questionable intelligence, the authorities charged him with treason.
Yeah. They imprisoned the newly baptized sultan, along with his family, and an entourage of 200 followers.
The logic of that decision is just highly questionable.
It's baffling.
The Spanish had secured a potential ally of immense regional influence, and instead of leveraging his authority, they incarcerated him over a paranoid interpretation of intercepted correspondence.
It essentially guaranteed that no other Moro leader would ever trust a Spanish offer of diplomacy or safe harbor.
It entirely destroyed their diplomatic credibility.
Completely. And their projection of military invincibility suffered a permanent blow just over a decade later.
Ah, yes. The British.
Right. During the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, a British expeditionary force arrived in Manila Bay in 1762.
They easily breached the city's defenses, captured the capital, and held it for 20 months.
Right. And the psychological ripple effect of the British occupation must have been huge for the southern sultanates.
It confirmed to the Moro leadership that the Spanish Empire was fundamentally vulnerable.
Exactly. If a rival European navy could sail directly into Manila Bay and dismantle the colonial capital, the Spanish were not some invincible, preordained authority.
And this realization heavily emboldened the sultanates, leading to an intensification of maritime raids throughout the late 1700s.
Which was devastating economically. The financial ledgers from this era detail an empire bleeding capital.
Yeah, by the 1790s, the Spanish treasury was expending over 1.5 million pesos fortes annually.
Solely to finance the naval patrols and repair the coastal fortifications required to combat the raiding fleets.
And the human toll in the Visayas was catastrophic. The records indicate that several coastal agricultural towns experienced a 50% population decline due to casualties and enslavement.
And a population loss of that magnitude destabilizes the entire colonial economic model.
Right, because the agricultural yields collapse.
The tax revenues disappear, and the administrative costs of maintaining a garrison presence just multiply.
Which prompts a necessary examination of Spanish grand strategy, I think. If the colony was a severe financial burden, sapping manpower and draining the royal treasury merely to maintain a violent, static frontier, what was the underlying imperative to remain?
Right.
I just struggle to believe it was purely a matter of imperial ego preventing a withdrawal.
Well, imperial ego was a factor, as conceding territory to indigenous resistance was politically unacceptable in Madrid.
Yeah.
But the primary driver was international geopolitical competition. The Spanish were acutely aware that the British, the Dutch, and the French were rapidly expanding their presence in Southeast Asia.
Ah, so if Spain formally abandoned Mindanao and Sulu,
Those archipelagos would immediately be annexed by rival European empires.
providing them with a highly strategic base directly adjacent to Spanish shipping lanes.
Exactly. Spain was trapped in a geographic war of attrition. They lacked the funds to win, but lacked the international security to abandon.
This brings us to a prolonged stalemate.
Yep.
The Spanish possessed deep draft, heavy sailing galleons loaded with heavy artillery. The Moros utilized prows, these highly maneuverable, shallow draft outrigger vessels,
Right, and this technological equilibrium persisted for centuries.
until a fundamental shift in naval architecture redefined the mechanics of the war.
Yes, the tipping point occurred in the mid-19th century with the integration of the steam engine into maritime warfare.
So as we move into the 1840s, the pressure on the Spanish administration increases exponentially. Foreign powers begin bypassing Manila entirely.
French, Dutch, and British emissaries start arriving in the southern islands to negotiate direct commercial treaties with the sultanates.
Right, in 1849, the British actually successfully conclude a treaty with the Sultan of Jolo.
And the Spanish command realizes their claim of sovereignty is evaporating internationally because they cannot physically control the waters.
So to reassert their authority, the Spanish Navy fundamentally upgrades its operational capabilities.
Yes, because for over 250 years, the mechanical realities of wind-powered sailing dictated naval engagements.
Right. A Spanish galleon possessed enormous destructive power, but its heavy draft restricted it to deep water.
And its movement was entirely reliant on the prevailing monsoons. When the wind dropped, a galleon basically became a stationary wooden fortress.
Unable to maneuver its fixed artillery to track moving targets.
Exactly. And the Moro maritime forces engineered their tactics specifically to exploit those mechanical limitations.
Because their prows relied on banks of oarsmen.
Right. In a dead calm, they could simply row their vessels into the galleon's blind spots, execute an assault.
Or retreat into the shallow, highly complex root systems of coastal mangrove swamps, where a heavy galleon would immediately run aground if it attempted pursuit.
Yes. But the purchase of advanced British-manufactured steam gunboats, specifically vessels like the Elcano, the Magallans, and later the Reina de Castilla in the 1840s and 60s, eliminated those environmental variables.
Because a coal-fired steam engine provides continuous, independent propulsion regardless of wind conditions.
Exactly. And the operational shift was immediate and devastating.
Let's consider the Spanish assault on the Balanguingui stronghold in 1848.
Yes. This island had functioned as a highly fortified, nearly impenetrable center for the maritime raiding fleets.
The traditional defenses relied on shallow reefs and complex currents to deter deep-draft sailing ships.
But General Narciso Claveria utilized the new steam gunboats to completely bypass those environmental defenses.
Right. The steamships navigated the treacherous coastal waters, anchored directly adjacent to the fortifications, and utilized their rifled artillery to dismantle the wooden structures.
And then the Spanish infantry assaulted the breached defenses.
The logistical accounting of the Balanguingui assault really highlights the efficiency of the new technology.
It does. The Spanish forces captured 79 pieces of artillery, neutralized hundreds of defenders, and extracted over 300 captives from the stronghold.
It was a precise, mechanized dismantling of a strategic asset.
The steamships allowed the Spanish command to dictate the temporal and spatial terms of naval engagements for the very first time.
They instituted effective blockades, disrupted the inter-island supply chains, and systematically destroyed the shipbuilding infrastructure.
By the late 1860s, the era of large-scale coordinated Moro maritime raiding was effectively neutralized. The technology secured the surface of the sea.
But analyzing this transition, I have to question the causality.
How so?
Did the acquisition of the steam engine alone secure this victory? Or was Spain forced into adopting this technology due to the diplomatic encroachments of the British and French? It seems unlikely that a global empire required 250 years to realize they needed shallower, independent propulsion.
Well, the two factors are inextricably linked. The technological capability to build smaller, oar-driven vessels existed previously.
Right.
But the Spanish naval doctrine heavily favored large, standardized sailing ships optimized for the trans-Pacific galleon trade. It was the acute diplomatic panic, the realization that British and French treaties were legally eroding Spanish territorial claims that forced the Treasury to allocate the huge capital required to purchase modern steamships from British shipyards.
Ah, so the geopolitical fear financed the technological solution.
Exactly.
But while the steamships successfully pacified the oceanic routes, they did not alter the resolve of the Moro leadership.
No, not at all. Deprived of their maritime operational capacity, the resistance just adapted.
The conflict transitioned from the open water to the densely forested interiors, triggering the adoption of highly lethal asymmetric warfare tactics.
And this tactical evolution becomes highly pronounced during the Jolo campaigns of the 1870s and 1880s.
Right. In 1876, the Spanish military apparatus marshaled an enormous expeditionary force specifically targeting Jolo, which was the primary capital of the Sulu Sultanate.
Following a heavy bombardment, they captured the settlement. And to ensure permanent occupation, they constructed Fort Alfonso XII.
Right, inserting a heavily fortified military garrison directly into the political and cultural center of the Sultanate.
And the Moro forces recognized that engaging a modernized, entrenched Spanish infantry regiment in conventional open-field combat would result in total annihilation.
It would be suicide.
Right. So their response was the institutionalization of a deeply controversial and psychologically devastating tactic known as the juramentado.
And the mechanics of the Germantado really require careful examination because it fundamentally altered the daily reality of the Spanish occupation.
It did. A juramentado was an individual warrior who underwent specific religious purification rituals, taking a solemn oath to execute a suicidal assassination mission against the Spanish military presence.
The objective was never to capture a position or win a tactical victory, was it?
No. The objective was to inflict sudden, extreme violence upon the occupying force, causing maximum casualties before the attacker was inevitably killed.
It was a calculated application of asymmetric psychological terror.
Yes. And the official incident reports from the garrison at Jolo detail the highly covert nature of these attacks. The juramentados did not assault the fort's main gates.
They exploited the daily necessary interactions between the military and the local economy.
Right. In November 1878, a group of 13 Moros approached the settlement's perimeter.
They appeared unarmed.
Exactly. But they had meticulously concealed high-quality forged blades inside the hollow sections of bamboo tubes typically used for transporting water.
And once they bypassed the initial checkpoints and entered a populated area, they simultaneously drew their weapons and initiated the attack.
They severely wounded 13 individuals before the garrison infantry could respond with concentrated rifle fire to neutralize them.
If you analyze the operational environment inside Fort Alfonso XII, the psychological degradation of the Spanish troops must have been profound.
Well, without a doubt.
I mean, they were occupying a tropical fortification where the sources indicate fevers, dysentery, and malaria routinely incapacitated hundreds of men simultaneously. To compound that physical deterioration with the constant ambient threat that any individual in the adjacent market could be carrying a concealed blade, it creates an unsustainable level of hypervigilance.
It really does. And the Spanish command recognized the fragility of their garrison's morale. So, to reduce the necessity for direct military engagement, they attempted to impose a political solution by subverting the local leadership hierarchy.
Right. In 1886, the Spanish governor-general intervened in a succession dispute and officially backed a claimant named Datu Harun as the new Sultan of Jolo.
Yes, and the methodology behind this appointment is very revealing. Datu Harun was selected primarily because he was the sole surviving Moro leader who had previously signed a treaty acknowledging Spanish sovereignty.
The Spanish military literally escorted him onto a gunboat, transporting him from coastal settlement to coastal settlement.
Utilizing the threat of naval bombardment to coerce the local datus into pledging allegiance to their designated ruler.
But the policy was a complete failure of political intelligence. You cannot legitimize an indigenous leader by explicitly demonstrating that his authority relies entirely on the artillery of an occupying foreign power.
Exactly. The regional datus vehemently rejected Harun. They consolidated their political and military support behind the widely recognized legitimate heir, Amaluquiram.
Which forced the Spanish military into the exact scenario they were trying to avoid.
Right. They had to launch grueling, casualty-heavy expeditionary campaigns into the island's interior, specifically engaging in heavy combat at Maibun and Tapul Island, solely to protect their fabricated sultan from his own people.
And ultimately, the administrative costs outweighed the political
They
benefits.
did. The Spanish government retreated from the policy, abandoned Harun, and formally recognized Amalekrim.
So while Sulu was this complex matrix of assassinations and political miscalculations, the Spanish military faced an entirely different logistical and strategic nightmare on the large southern island of Mindanao.
Yes, specifically within the sprawling, complex ecosystem of the Rio Grande Delta.
And the environment of the Rio Grande Valley during the 1880s dictated a fundamentally different type of warfare. The Spanish forces were attempting to neutralize a highly influential regional leader named Datu Uto.
Right. General Emilio Terrero mobilized a huge campaign in 1886 to penetrate Uto's territory.
But the physical environment systematically degraded the Spanish advance. The Rio Grande Delta is this labyrinth of muddy tributaries and dense vegetation.
And the campaign reports describe operations severely compromised by torrential monsoon rains.
The Spanish encampments frequently flooded, transforming into lakes of mud.
The infantry regiments were forced to march waist-deep through the swamps, which completely negates the mobility and discipline required for European tactical formations.
But the environmental hazards were secondary to the technological shock the Spanish encountered.
Yes, this is crucial.
As they advanced through the mud, expecting to face warriors armed with traditional forged blades and outdated smoothbore muskets they were subjected to sustained rapid fire from American-manufactured Spencer repeating rifles.
Which is astounding. The presence of highly advanced lever-action repeating rifles deep within the Mindanao swamps completely invalidated the Spanish assumption that their naval blockade was isolating the Moros from the global arms market.
This really necessitates a deep dive into the logistical mechanisms sustaining Datu Uto's forces, because how does a regional leader, supposedly contained by a perimeter of Spanish steam gunboats, procure high-end American munitions?
Well, the supply chain was managed by a highly sophisticated transnational network of Chinese merchants.
Right.
These mercantile syndicates operated largely out of British-controlled ports like Singapore, as well as maintaining deep roots in the coastal cities of China.
They possessed their own commercial steamers and navigated the complex maritime borders of Southeast Asia with extreme proficiency. And the economic model driving this smuggling operation is fascinating in its complexity. The Chinese merchants controlled the importation of high-value goods, textiles, luxury ivory, and notably vast quantities of opium.
Yes, they ran the Spanish blockades, utilizing their deep knowledge of the archipelagic currents and shallow channels to avoid the heavier Spanish gunboats.
And once ashore, they exchanged these commodities, along with the repeating rifles, for the natural resources controlled by the sultanates.
Primarily pearls, sea cucumber, and the captive human labor generated by the Moro raids.
So the Spanish were not simply fighting a localized insurgency. They were attempting to disrupt a highly capitalized, deeply entrenched global supply chain.
Exactly. And furthermore, this economic integration fostered permanent sociopolitical structures. We see extensive intermarriage between the non-Muslim Chinese merchants and the upper echelons of Moro society.
Which created a new, highly resilient power dynamic. A prominent example from the sources is Datu Piang.
Yes.
His father was Tuyatan, a wealthy Chinese merchant operating out of Amoy, and his mother was a local Maguindanao woman.
Right. And Datu Piang leveraged both his father's international commercial networks and his mother's local political lineage to amass tremendous wealth.
He eventually became one of the most dominant political figures in the entire Mindanao region.
He did. Because Datu Uto commanded forces equipped with modern repeating rifles and backed by an international supply chain, he possessed the capability to drag the Spanish into an agonizing war of attrition.
Right. After weeks of suffering in the flooded delta and subjecting Udo's wooden fortifications to heavy artillery bombardment, General Terrero did manage to corner the Datu.
He did. However, the resulting cessation of hostilities was highly unconventional.
Reading the details of the agreement, it lacks all the hallmarks of a formal military surrender. It reads remarkably like a calculated business negotiation.
It really does.
If the Spanish had cornered him with superior artillery, why didn't they demand unconditional capitulation?
Because both commanders accurately calculated their logistical limitations. Datu Uto recognized that the concentrated Spanish artillery could eventually level his physical infrastructure.
Right.
However, General Terrero recognized that his army was suffering heavily from disease and exposure.
And that permanently occupying a flooded delta populated by insurgents armed with repeating rifles was strategically impossible.
Exactly. So the resulting treaty was a compromise. It allowed the Spanish administration to declare a victorious pacification in their reports to Manila and Madrid.
But in exchange, Datu Uto retained his life, the majority of his accumulated wealth, and his political influence.
He essentially agreed to a temporary ceasefire, waiting for the Spanish expeditionary force to exhaust its supplies and retreat from the swamp.
And that tactical retreat leads directly to the final phase of Spanish military operations in the region.
Yes, as the timeline approaches the 1890s.
The Spanish command in Manila realizes that after over 3 centuries of conflict, their control is entirely relegated to the coastal perimeters and river deltas.
Right. There remained a vast, heavily populated region in the deep interior of Mindanao that no Spanish soldier had observed since the 1630s.
The Lake Lanao Basin.
Yes. Situated high in the interior plateau, it was the cultural and political center of the Maranao people.
And in the 1890s, successive Spanish governors, first Valeriano Weyler and subsequently Ramon Blanco, formulated an aggressive strategy to definitively conquer the lake region.
And the Maranao resistance, organized under powerful leaders like Amani Pakpak, immediately fortified their defensive structures, which were known as cotos.
These earth and timber forts were designed to absorb small arms fire and repel infantry assaults.
Right. The Spanish engineers assessed the terrain and concluded that traditional expeditionary columns could not sustain an advance through the dense jungle gradients.
To conquer the interior, they realized they had to permanently alter the geography.
So the Spanish military initiated a massive infrastructural engineering project. They began carving a wide, graded wagon road directly through the jungle canopy to facilitate the movement of heavy artillery and supplies.
They surveyed and began laying the groundwork for a formalized railway system designed to connect the coastal ports directly to the shores of Lake Lanao.
The engineering logistics required for this endeavor were immense. The sources detail the construction of the Bridge of Alfonso XIII, an enormous suspension bridge spanning the turbulent Agus River.
And the architectural specifications were rigorous. The bridge was engineered with the structural integrity necessary to bear the weight of heavy railway locomotives.
However, the manual labor required to clear the jungle, grade the earth, and construct the infrastructure could not be supplied by the regular infantry.
No. The Spanish administration utilized a highly specific and ultimately volatile labor force known as the disciplinarios.
Right. The disciplinarios were native conscripts drawn directly from the population of the Bilibid prison complex in Manila.
The Spanish military offered these inmates a commutation of their sentences in exchange for their deployment to the front lines in Mindanao,
where they served simultaneously as heavy laborers and expendable shock troops.
But deploying armed convicts as the vanguard of a colonial engineering project is fraught with inherent risks.
Oh, entirely. And the vulnerability of this strategy was exposed catastrophically in 1896, driven by political detonations occurring hundreds of miles to the north.
Right. In August of 1896, the broader Philippine Revolution ignited. The Tagalog populations in Luzon launched a coordinated, widespread insurrection aimed at entirely dismantling Spanish colonial rule.
And information regarding the northern uprising rapidly filtered down the maritime trade routes and reached the disciplinarios stationed in the Mindanao labor camps.
Recognizing that the Spanish military apparatus was suddenly fighting for its survival in the capital, hundreds of the armed convicts orchestrated a violent mutiny.
They assassinated their Spanish commanding officers, seized control of the munitions depots, and defected into the dense jungles of the Misamis region.
Actively joining the resistance against the colonial forces.
Right. And the timing of the mutiny highlights a profound historical paradox. The Spanish engineers were finally succeeding in their logistical penetration of the most difficult terrain in the archipelago.
They had successfully transported disassembled steam gunboats up the wagon roads, reassembled them on the shores of Lake Lanao, and established a functioning suspension bridge.
They were on the precipice of achieving operational control of the deep interior.
Exactly at that zenith of their engineering achievement, the foundations of the entire Spanish Empire began to disintegrate.
And the subsequent outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898 finalized the collapse.
The Spanish military was forced to rapidly reallocate every available resource to defend against the American naval and ground forces.
The campaign in Mindanao was instantly starved of capital, munitions, and manpower.
The final orders executed by the Spanish commanders in Mindanao reflect the totality of their defeat. Recognizing they could not safely transport their assets back to the coast, the Spanish engineers deliberately scuttled their own steam gunboats,
Sinking them into the depths of Lake Lanao. They evacuated Fort Alfonso XII and abandoned the newly constructed infrastructure to the advancing Moro forces.
Evaluating the legacy of this 333-year conflict requires parsing the difference between military failure and geopolitical impact for you. The Spanish forces definitively failed to achieve their primary objective.
Right. They did not subjugate the Moro population, and they did not universally impose Catholicism on the southern islands.
So did their presence amount to a complete strategic failure, or did the centuries of warfare fundamentally alter the trajectory of the region?
Well, the Spanish occupation irrevocably transformed the political and economic landscape.
How so?
Their introduction of steam-powered naval blockades permanently dismantled the vast transoceanic Moro raiding networks, forcing the sultanates to reorient their economies internally.
And the constant military pressure accelerated the centralization of political power among specific Moro elites.
Furthermore, the Spanish cartographers established the internationally recognized borders that bound the Islamic South to the Catholic North.
Laying the complex legal and territorial foundations for the modern Philippine state, regardless of their actual physical control over that territory.
Exactly.
It presents a highly compelling historical reality. For over 3 centuries, the Spanish crown relentlessly funneled silver from the Americas across the Pacific to finance the construction of stone forts, the purchase of British steamships, and the deployment of thousands of soldiers into the jungles of Mindanao and Sulu.
They exhausted the administrative capacity of their empire, attempting to force the capitulation of the sultanates.
Yet, when the final Spanish garrisons evacuated their southern outposts in 1899, they did not leave behind a pacified territory.
No, they evacuated a region populated by deeply entrenched, highly organized societies.
They handed over a landscape controlled by Moro Datis, who possessed extensive combat experience, sophisticated international supply lines, and arsenals stocked with modern repeating rifles.
Directly to the forces of the United States.
The global empires transitioned, the geopolitical objectives shifted, but the struggle for sovereignty in the southern archipelagos was merely reloading for an entirely new, heavily industrialized phase of conflict. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.